So today we're going to be talking about genetic engineering and some of the applications for it in the field of science. I want you to write down information, just some general information from each of these slides as you're watching this. The next time you have class, you're going to be picking one of these topics or subtopics and doing additional research on your own to explore them and learn a little bit more about the topic that you choose. So as we're going through here, kind of start thinking about which ones maybe seem the most interesting to you. The first one I want to talk about is CRISPR. CRISPR is a gene editing tool, and you can see in that image here, it kind of walks you through how it's used to edit. You have like a guide sequence of RNA, and you have a protein that can act like a scissor. So the RNA will line up and pair up with a strand of DNA, and they'll cut out the unwanted DNA and replace it with something else. You're hearing about CRISPR a lot lately in the news because it's fast, it's cheap, and it's really accurate. So it's being used a lot lately. There's tons and tons of uses for CRISPR. Transgenic plants and animals. This is where you take a gene from one organism and you put it into another organism that doesn't normally have that gene. So you're going from one to another. The Flavor Saver tomato was one of the first crops that was approved for consumption using this method. Flavor Saver tomatoes are no longer sold in the stores, but you could go and look why is it not sold anymore, and how did they create that tomato. BT corn is where they took some genes from bacteria and put it into the corn to make like a natural pesticide. There are animals that are transgenic, and like glowfish. These mice aren't something you could buy, but they're used in research. So why would we want to create glowing animals for research? That would be something that you could research and look into yourself. I want to talk quickly about the difference between GMO and transgenic. So GMO is probably the term you have heard, genetically modified organism. So all transgenic organisms are GMOs, but not all GMOs are transgenic. You can take something like this apple and you could turn off the gene that makes it brown, and now you have an apple that won't brown as quick. Okay, we didn't add anything different, we just turned something off. So that's an example of a GMO that is not transgenic. Cloning is the process where you take a single cell from an adult to grow an entirely new organism that is genetically identical to the original. There's talk about maybe using this method to bring back extinct animals. Is that something we should be doing? And then just to make a note that plant cloning happens all the time. Anytime you take a cutting from a plant and grow a new plant from that cutting, that's cloning. Gene therapy is when you take and change a person's gene, like find one gene and change it to treat a disease or a disorder. You're going to watch a video that shows how gene therapy can be used to treat sickle cell. And so that's another interesting thing. What diseases could be treated with gene therapy? Designer babies, this is the idea where you could take a human embryo and modify it, right, to produce desirable traits. We do this to some extent now with IVF. We can select a fetus that doesn't have a disease. Like if the parents are carriers, they could use IVF to ensure that their child doesn't inherit a recessive disorder. IVF, you can also select for the biological sex using that as well. Some of the sci-fi things you might hear about, we're not really close to doing any of that with IVF and designer babies. Genetic testing. So genetic testing can either be used to test chromosomes to see if there's a genetic condition. If somebody has a genetic condition, this could be done in adults. It can be done on unborn fetuses. Genetic testing also can be done by those companies like 23andMe, Ancestry, right? You can test to see, uh, heredity, like where your ancestors came from, but they also, like 23andMe will test to see if you carry different traits as well, or different disorders. That kind of gets into this idea of genetic privacy and ownership. So, who would want to have access to your genetic information? Who should have access to your genetic information? Now that if you send your DNA to those companies like 23andMe, what are they allowed to do with that information? Uh, should it be kept confidential? Can they share it? Can or should GMOs, like genetic codes of GMOs, be patented? So there's a lot of really interesting things that you can look into when it comes to genetic privacy and ownership. The last thing I wanted to mention is forensics, DNA forensics. So the first thing you think of, right, is using DNA as crime scene evidence. Okay, that's kind of the most obvious. So you could look into DNA forensics and how it's used and how accurate it is as evidence. But you could also explore this idea of using DNA forensics in wildlife conservation. So scientists can use DNA forensics to, like, say, track down poaching or illegal animal trade, or even testing populations to see if there's inbreeding due to isolation and things like that. So these are just a few of the kind of current topics in DNA and genetic engineering. There's lots more out there, though, that we could explore and learn about.